Hey everybody, thank you for joining me today. Today I have Clay Llewellyn, COO at Income Property Specialists, and we're going to talk about market data and how we're going to jump back into the Wayback Machine and talk about what we did years ago on getting comp data and that sort of thing. And then we're going to go through time and find out how they experimented with different approaches to getting market data and where they are at now. So Clay, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I really appreciate being here. Thank you for the invite.
So I'm gonna maybe get a little nostalgic as
Sure.
we talk about some of this stuff because I remember back in my leasing consultant days years and years ago about calling up comps, you call it saying okay what are your rates, and there were a host of issues there. But let's kind of walk back through that process. So tell me about what y'all were doing several years ago on that process, and we'll see if it matches up with what I had to do.
Sure. Yeah. So I remember when I first started the industry, we had to do all of our market survey calls on a regular basis, usually beginning of the week. Um, you kind of figured out which leasing agents at the other properties you're talking to we're gonna give you uh, we're gonna cooperate on the information that they were providing. And it was always just very manual. Hey, let me, what do you have available right now? For your one bedrooms, what are we looking at? And those comps were pretty much set at the corporate level. And so there wasn't a whole lot of art to it. I think it was just very, very scientific. Here's the data. This is what we're looking at, and figure it out from there. And so when I moved over to the income property specialist about 10 years ago, we kind of were doing the same thing still. Everything was very, very manually conducted. You have your comps that you're used to, that that tenants are moving back and forth from, and it was a lot of concession driven data. Uh, when there are rate changes, you can kind of get a sense of where their issues were on their occupancy. If it's all one bedrooms, all two bedrooms, whatever that may be, it kind of tells a story. And so that was a very tedious and frankly inaccurate process. And so we're always looking for better ways to find market.
Yeah, I remember you get some data and you're like, there's no possible way they are leasing at these rates. Like they were
There's no way.
sharing,
Yeah.
they didn't want to tell us concessions or anything. They're going to
Yeah.
share like the market rate, and it's like there's no way. So
Yep.
obviously accuracy. It's so funny because now data accuracy is such a big topic, but man, there were
Hmm.
so many issues that came into that. So there's a lot of challenges with that. Also, the time it takes
Yep.
to go through that process every time. They don't answer, you have to call back. So let's walk forward just a few steps and go, okay, so now you want to automate this, or you want to find a better way. What was your
Yeah.
next step?
Yeah. So I mean, I had before I had left the firm I was with before IPS. We had used a revenue management. We'd just started using a revenue management software, and as IPS was growing, I just realized that the manual process really just wasn't working for us anymore. And so we engaged with that same revenue management tool, and I think it's easy to fall into the path of least resistance when you are conducting those market surveys. And I think that I probably a lot of our staff were just calling the properties to who they knew were going to answer and give feedback, and not necessarily, there's a lot of selection bias and didn't encapsulate the entire market data that really would have given us the information we needed to make uh, good business decisions. And so pushing towards an automated revenue management platform, this is I want to say in 2018 or so, allowed us to not just get specific information from specific properties that we've identified as comps, but also larger market data of that neighborhood and of that area, to kind of show where the rents were going up, down, staying flat, where concessions were coming in. And obviously, because it was an automated process, we took a lot of the man hours out of the equation, and just relied on the computer to tell us what we needed to do. And of course, then we had automatically seen a pretty significant uptick in in leasing activity and a downward trend on vacancy loss. So there was a pretty significant cash flow upside on leveraging that technology.
Sure, sure.
Yeah,
And so then, since then, you've kind of pivoted again. So let's talk about. I
yeah,
think you brought it back manual again. So kind of go walk us through there.
yeah. So as I'm sure many of the listeners are aware that the private data market survey, the revenue management platform relying on private data, got the industry in some hot water for the benefit of ourselves, our clients, and the liability exposed, and just a sense of obligation to the general public who are relying on where housing prices are. We brought it back manually, brought it back in house. I want to say this is around 2022 or so, and so for a good number of years we were relying on automated market survey. In that time, there was a lot of turnover in our on-site staff. It's a kind of turnover heavy industry, and so that wasn't necessarily unexpected, especially at that time. A lot of people were deciding that the industry wasn't quite for them. And so it was definitely a burden going through and retraining and training from the jump on for a bunch of our on-site staff who had never done a manual market survey before. They've been so reliant on the tools that all of a sudden, kind of overnight, became unavailable for them. That it was a bit of a challenge, and we're the easiest thing to do for our managers. We talk to them about, hey, I need you to give me a handful of 5 to 7 comps for this property. The easiest thing to do is look across the street, down the street, hey, these properties are nearby, and that's not necessarily where you're losing your tenants to.
Yeah, their search approach is completely different than that. I mean,
Yeah,
it may be some element of, hey, we're driving the area and they see something,
sure.
but a lot of times they're searching online and that's going to filter it down.
Hmm.
And yeah, absolutely. And I think what's really interesting is this idea of adding in a task so again, rewind the clock.
Yeah,
When we were doing market surveys, that was just part of the process. We never really thought about necessarily what is the cost of the time of
sure.
doing that because it's embedded. But once you have to re-embed it, then it becomes very obvious about that labor cost.
Yeah,
That now, I'm sure that you filled up your leasing consultant's time with other things. It's not like when you took that task away from them, they were just kind of sitting on their hands for that amount of time. They had other things to do. And so
yep,
now you have to add this new task back in. And now it becomes very clear about what the cost is of adding that task in, which I think is interesting because most people
yeah,
don't see it that way, I don't
yeah.
think.
Yeah, I mean, and we did it that way for a short period. Realized that just wasn't a winning process anymore, just because the organizational knowledge on how to conduct an accurate and pervasive market survey just kind of escaped the company.
Yeah.
And so we brought that process in house with just one centralized resource. They're spending 25 to 30 hours a week on just that process for our entire portfolio, which was a slight improvement, just because we had at least a consistent um, methodology across the board, and so we were able to kind of get the information we needed to make our pricing decisions. But one of the problems you run into there is that the advantage you have on site is there's a lot of nuance in that market, in that neighborhood, that gets lost when it's one person in a centralized area that's conducting their market survey process.
They lose a little bit of the market knowledge overall
Yeah,
just because they're not calling around and they don't know
yeah,
who their comps are.
yeah. I mean, it's usually they're the first to know if if one of the larger employers in that specific neighborhood may start conducting layoffs, and
Yeah.
that has a change to an impact to how the market's going to interact, and where pricing needs to be in order to maintain occupancy without leaving too much money on the table.
Interesting. And also it kind of feeds into that discussion about the cost of labor because now you know exactly how many hours for
Hmm.
that one person. So if you're
Yeah,
saying 25 hours of labor and you multiply that out, you have exact cost of what does market
Sure.
data collection look like, which again, most companies probably don't have a specific number for that, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, and we're a smaller to medium sized firm. I'm sure there are larger outfits there who, that impact is much more significant to their bottom line and how much they're really committing to that cost.
So you went from redoing it manually
Hmm.
on site. Now at this point, you've gone to a centralized model. You have one person doing it 25, 30 hours a week of pulling that data. And then where did you go from there?
Yeah, from there we had got introduced to Apartment IQ. I think at the time they were either Rentable or Abode. They'd rebranded a few times and landed on Apartment IQ within this specific tool, and um, that was a game changer for us. Obviously it checks the most important box for us, which is the reliance on public data. But it's also an automated tool that um, um, you know takes away a lot of those man hours that were burdening our organization. And so as a result, we started getting better information coming in, and they're always making updates and improvements, and finding new and interesting ways that we can leverage that information um, to tell the story, because that's what the market survey is intended to do, is tell a story of what's happening in the market right now. It's a snapshot in time, but if you look at enough of those snapshots, there's a trend that indicates, all right, this is what's happening, this is how we solve the problem. And one of the tools that they offer that I think is most interesting is they can see how long an individual vacancy has been, or available unit, if it was on notice, had been available to the market. And
Wow.
so that tells the story. In some of our individual neighborhoods, we sit on vacancy for longer than we feel comfortable with, but we look at what everybody else is doing, and their average day vacancy might be over 30 days. And so that tells the story of that, all right, that neighborhood, that market, they think that the activity is going to rebound. And so they don't want to be the first one to blink and chase the market down. We're going to wait and sit on a little bit of vacancy loss, and we'll get it rented at a point that makes sense for us. Because you have to remember, our properties are all under rent control. So lowering the base rent is a decision that does not come easily. When we want to get the unit rented, vacancy loss, you can never recover that. But we do want to make sure we're protecting the base rent, so that if the market does increase over the next year or two, those units aren't caught too far behind on what they are able to collect.
Yeah, and you can't get that sort of granular data when you're thinking about a centralized person at that point.
No,
And especially doing it manually on site. Like the idea of
yeah,
having
there's no
that
way.
type of information just wouldn't exist.
Yeah,
I'm curious about how many companies are still doing it the same way that, you and I did it, decades ago. I'm sure there's a good chunk that still do the call up method
yeah.
and see how that goes.
I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure we do some outdated things still too. I mean, when I first started with the company, um, we were having our on-site staff actually fax leases into the corporate office for one of the licensed individuals to sign the lease and fax it back. And it was a nightmare. And, that was less than 10 years ago. So I'm sure there are other things that are happening that are, practically inefficient, but just because of history and just the lack of need to change, that we're probably still doing some of those things that don't really make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, it's interesting how external forces really
Hmm.
drive change. When it's easy to keep momentum, it's easy to
Yeah.
keep doing the way we're doing it, but then sometimes outside forces can be a real blessing. Even though there may be costs to it as well. So
And the
really important.
necessity and invention and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One more thing, you had talked about shifting towards public data when you're
Yeah.
pulling data from external sources. Tell me about how you view the benefits of public data from that perspective.
Well, obviously, there's liability concerns, which we need to be cognizant of. Um, and the other reality is, I think, one of the advantages we thought we had with the other services that did look at some of the private data, it would show what the actual contracted rent might be rather than what was advertised. But at the
Hmm.
end of the day, we're comparing ourselves against against what the public is seeing. And so if there's a $50 or $100 reduction in the rent on the contract rent relative to what was advertised, I really don't care that much because when I'm not comparing myself against what is now off the market. I'm comparing myself against what else is available, public facing, and that's I think that changed the calculation for us quite a bit in how we really view the benefits of public data.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they're still comparing and contrasting you relative to what they're seeing
Right.
online and whatever. That's their, again, going back to that filter, they're kind of narrowing the focus based upon that, which is what you want
And
to be looking
yeah, and
at.
we have enough history on kind of leasing activity trends as on a seasonal basis. We expect that rents from March till about September or so are going to be much stronger than those from November through January. And so we can make those decisions without relying on private internal data to tell us that if we have somebody who's moving in January, fine. We don't need to move them in on a 12-month lease. We can go a little bit longer and make it more competitive to make sense for the tenant at the time. And if they do decide they're going to vacate, they're going to vacate during a time frame that makes more sense for us. And we have enough background and history on that we can make that work.
Fantastic. Clay, thank you so much
Yeah,
for taking some time with me today.
of
This is
course,
a huge
Brent.
topic right now, and so I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing. So, everybody, thank you all for joining us today and watching myself and Clay get into market data. And we will see you next time. Take care,
All right.
everybody.
Thanks, Brent.